It started with a handwritten invitation. Pressed between official White House folders and policy briefings, Karoline Leavitt found it as she was preparing for a press conference. The card was simple: ivory parchment, gold trim, and a deep blue emblem embossed with the words "Unity in Faith, National Prayer Sunday." The event was to be held at St. Luke's Cathedral in Washington, D.C., an interfaith gathering co-hosted by the Vice President's Office and the U.S. Council on Religious Inclusion. It was billed as a nonpartisan space for reflection and peace, attended by spiritual leaders, lawmakers, and White House representatives from every administration in the last 30 years. Karoline blinked twice at the signature at the bottom. Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, her chief of staff, leaned over her shoulder. "Looks like they're including everyone this year." Karoline smiled faintly. "Apparently, even me." There had been tension between them. Quiet, but undeniable. Kamala had never spoken to Karoline directly since her appointment. Their only interactions came through distant press statements, subtle digs in interviews, and the occasional sidelong glance during state events. Still, Karoline believed in good faith, literally. She attended Mass every Sunday, wore her silver cross openly, and never hid the fact that her work in the White House was as much spiritual conviction as it was civic duty. So she RSVP'd with a simple note: "Honored to attend. Grateful to pray together." The week leading up to the event was quiet. No hostility, no red flags. Just a carefully worded program that listed Karoline under open prayer contributors. Emma confirmed the details. "You'll go up right after the rabbi, just before VP Harris gives her closing words." Karoline nodded, relieved. She had already begun writing the prayer. Something simple but powerful, about healing, about truth, about courage. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that in the hours before she stepped into that sacred space, a quiet decision had already been made. Her mic was being pulled. And the person behind that decision was the very one who'd signed the invitation. The morning of the event arrived with unseasonable warmth, and St. Luke's Cathedral glowed under the soft gold of early sunlight. Media vans were lined up along both curbs. Inside, the air was thick with incense and diplomacy. Karoline arrived early, dressed simply but sharply in a navy blue blazer, her silver cross resting neatly at her collar. Emma trailed behind her, clutching a manila folder labeled "Prayer Final Draft." As they stepped inside, Karoline paused under the tall arch of the church doors. The sanctuary was vast, adorned with stained glass that caught the sun like jeweled fire. Wooden pews were filled with senators, cabinet officials, foreign dignitaries, and media correspondents disguised in Sunday best. At the front, the program host, a neutral face from the Interfaith Council, greeted her warmly. "Miss Leavitt, welcome. Seating is to the right, third row." Emma leaned in as they walked. "Still says you're up after the rabbi." Karoline nodded. Her speech rested in her lap, folded carefully, a personal prayer inked by hand the night before. It wasn't political, it wasn't partisan. It was about asking for wisdom in chaotic times. But something felt off. Kamala Harris hadn't arrived yet, but her senior aide, a stern-looking woman in a beige pantsuit, stood off stage speaking quickly into an earpiece. The sound team near the altar adjusted microphones more times than necessary. Karoline caught one of them glancing her way, then turning back to whisper behind a clipboard. Emma whispered, "Too many eyes. Something's up." Karoline kept her composure. She had walked into plenty of rooms where she wasn't wanted. That was the nature of truth. It made people uncomfortable. But here? A church? This was supposed to be above that. At 11:02 a.m., the ceremony began. A Baptist pastor spoke first. Then a Buddhist monk offered a meditative chant. A rabbi followed with a blessing on national conscience. Then, the host returned to the podium and cleared his throat. "And now, we welcome our final speaker before Vice President Harris." Karoline sat up. Congresswoman Elena Ramirez will offer the final reflection. Karoline blinked. Emma's eyes widened. Ramirez? She wasn't on the program. Karoline leaned forward slightly, lips parting. But no one turned toward her. The music began to play as Ramirez walked calmly to the pulpit, prayer in hand. The audience applauded politely. Emma whispered, "They cut you." And Karoline just sat there, cross at her collar, speech in her lap, heart pounding. In a church built for truth, her voice had just been silenced. Karoline didn't flinch. Not at first. Years of political firestorms had taught her how to sit still when the floor gave out beneath her. But in that moment, as the warm applause for Congresswoman Ramirez faded, something in her chest tightened. The mic hadn't just been moved. It had been erased. There had been no warning, no explanation, and worst of all, no public acknowledgement. On paper, she had never been scheduled. Her name was gone from the projection screen. The open prayer contributors line now included a different list, reshuffled to conveniently exclude her. Emma leaned over. This wasn't a scheduling mishap. This was a decision. Karoline nodded slowly, eyes on the stage. Ramirez's reflection was gentle, even poetic. "Let us lift one another, regardless of creed, regardless of class," she intoned. It was well written, respectful, safe, and completely apolitical. Karoline knew what had happened. The night before, a producer from a major network had retweeted one of her old interviews where she defended prayer in schools. The usual crowd had piled on, calling her too extreme, a culture warrior, a partisan voice hiding behind a Bible. Kamala's staff must have seen the trend and decided she wasn't safe to hand a microphone. Not here. Not on national broadcast from a cathedral. Not next to the Vice President. "She's too polarizing," they probably said. "She might turn this into a political speech. She wears her cross too loudly." Karoline lowered her gaze. Her folded prayer still sat in her hands, the ink from last night still drying on the final line. "Lord, grant us courage to speak truth, even when the room grows silent around us." When Kamala Harris finally took the stage, the church rose to its feet. She wore a deep plum blazer and spoke with the careful warmth of a seasoned politician. She thanked the interfaith leaders. She smiled at the children's choir. She emphasized unity more than a dozen times. But not once did she look toward Karoline. Not once did she acknowledge the name she had signed on the invitation. Not once did she say why a prayer had gone missing. As the service ended and the organ rang out its final hymn, Karoline stood quietly. The crowd began filing out, unaware or unconcerned. She didn't need a spotlight. She needed a moment. And if the stage had been taken from her, she'd find another. As the final notes of the organ faded and the crowd began to trickle out of St. Luke's Cathedral, Karoline remained seated. People bustled past her in Sunday silence, heels clicking, murmurs of polite conversation, the rustle of suits and scarves. But she didn't move, not out of protest, out of prayer. She unfolded the paper in her hands, the one she'd written at midnight in her apartment, each line considered with care. It was a prayer meant to be spoken, not read in solitude. It was meant to be shared, not silenced. Emma turned to her. "You okay?" Karoline didn't answer right away. She stared ahead at the now empty pulpit where Kamala Harris had stood moments ago, offering polished, poll-tested words about togetherness. "Unity requires no fear," Harris had said. Yet her team had feared Karoline's voice enough to erase it. Karoline took a breath, stood slowly, and stepped to the edge of the pew. Emma's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Karoline whispered. "Praying." With deliberate calm, Karoline walked up the aisle, not toward the stage but to the center of the sanctuary, where the ceiling opened into a stained glass dome. The sunlight pierced through, scattering colors across the marble floor like divine confetti. She turned around. A few dozen people still lingered. Staffers, interns, camera techs, a few clergy. No one was watching her yet. So she spoke. "This is the prayer I wrote for today." Her voice was firm, not loud, but clear. One man turned, then another. Karoline unfolded the paper. "Heavenly Father," she began, "grant us clarity in a time of noise. Give us discernment when narratives bend truth. And fill our hearts with courage, not to dominate, but to stand when it's easier to sit still." A young seminarian paused mid-walk and stood still. A photographer raised his lens slowly, unsure. Karoline continued, her voice growing. "Let us not fear the words that come from conviction. Let us not hide behind unity that silences dissent. Let us never mistake silence for peace." By now, dozens were watching. The sound tech who had unplugged her mic stood frozen near a pillar. A CNN reporter leaned against the back wall, eyes narrowing, then widening. Emma stood nearby, stunned. Karoline read the final line, her voice steady as stone. "And if our words are not welcome from the pulpit, then let our pews become pulpits, and our voices still rise." She folded the paper. Silence. Then a single clap. Then more. Within seconds, the cathedral echoed with applause. Not thunderous, but honest. No microphone, no lights. But every soul present had heard her. The applause faded slowly, but the moment clung to the room like incense. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply nodded, folded her prayer once more, and walked out of St. Luke's Cathedral, shoulders square, steps measured. She didn't need to say anything else. She had already said enough. Outside, the air was crisper now. A breeze cut through the early spring warmth as camera crews repositioned equipment and reporters lingered for post-event interviews. Emma caught up to her on the steps. They didn't see that coming. Karoline didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere, on the people who had heard her, the ones who clapped, and the ones who didn't. She hadn't planned to speak from the aisle. But when the pulpit was taken, something deeper stepped in. The voice that had been denied a microphone had still found a way. A junior correspondent from a Christian news network approached cautiously. "Miss Leavitt, do you mind if we ask what just happened inside?" Karoline stopped, looked directly into the camera. "I was invited to pray. I showed up to do just that. They took away my mic, so I offered the prayer anyway. I don't need volume to speak truth." The clip hit social media before Karoline even reached her SUV. The caption was simple. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the room. Within an hour, the video had been reposted by faith leaders, free speech advocates, and even journalists who typically kept their distance from MAGA politics. Some called it brave. Others called it performative. But one tweet stood out above the noise. They silenced her stage. She found a sanctuary instead. Back at the White House, the communications team stared at the trending hashtags. Leavitt prayer. Mick denied faith delivered. Sanctuary speech. The press pool began requesting a statement. Karoline offered none. Instead, she sat in her office alone, replaying the moment in her head. Not the applause, not the silence, but the words. The ones she didn't say for show, but from conviction. Later that night, Kamala Harris's office released a brief statement through a press intermediary. Programming adjustments were made for timing and security. We respect all voices. Karoline read the sentence twice. Then she pulled out her pen and added a note to the bottom of her prayer draft. When they fear your words, whisper louder. By sunrise the next day, Karoline's prayer had crossed more than the cathedral walls. It had crossed oceans. Clips of her standing in the aisle, delivering a prayer without permission, had spread beyond the political bubble. French and Polish newspapers ran headlines like, "American official denied prayer, delivers anyway." A popular Brazilian evangelical network translated her words with the headline, "Faith that couldn't be canceled." But it was the domestic response that surprised her team most. A pastor from Tulsa, Oklahoma, played the prayer on his live stream that morning. A teacher in rural Georgia used it to begin a civics class. A Catholic nun from Pennsylvania posted a reaction on TikTok that garnered 1 million likes in 12 hours, saying, "She didn't scream, she didn't storm out, she didn't shame, she stood and prayed anyway. That's strength." Meanwhile, traditional outlets scrambled to catch up. Some tried to paint the moment as political theater. Others downplayed it as a misunderstanding, but they couldn't erase the video, and they couldn't rewrite what it showed. Karoline Leavitt had been silenced by authority, and answered with conviction. In the White House press room, the questions started flying. Was the Vice President aware Karoline's name had been removed? Will the White House respond to the backlash from faith leaders? Does Ms. Leavitt plan to address this again publicly? But Karoline kept silent, for now. Instead, she focused on the flood of emails pouring into her office. Messages from people she'd never met. Some devout, some skeptical, some lifelong conservatives, others lifelong Democrats. But all with a common thread. They felt something shift. You reminded me that standing still can still move people. You showed what dignity looks like when denied a voice. My daughter prayed out loud for the first time today. Because you did. Emma, sorting through the inbox, looked up and said, "You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for everyone who's ever been shut out of a room and stayed anyway." Karoline didn't smile, she just whispered almost to herself. Then maybe losing the mic was the only way I was supposed to be heard. By mid-afternoon, the West Wing was unusually quiet. Karoline had just finished a closed-door meeting with the communications team when her desk phone rang. A line reserved for only one source lit up. POTUS, private. She picked it up without hesitation. Mr. President Trump's voice came through calm but sharp, his signature tone when he meant every word. "Karoline, I saw what they did, and I saw what you did." There was no need to elaborate. He didn't say Kamala's name, didn't mention the cathedral or the statement from her office, because everyone already knew. You didn't yell. You didn't beg. You stood up and spoke truth. That's how it's done. Karoline replied quietly. I didn't want to make a scene. I just didn't want the prayer to vanish. Trump paused, then added with more edge. You did more than deliver a prayer. You delivered a message, and they heard it in every corner of the country. You stood your ground in God's house. That matters. The call ended as quickly as it had begun, but the words stayed with her. Later that evening, Trump posted to Truth Social. Karoline Leavitt showed real strength and real grace. She was silenced, but her faith spoke louder. Incredible moment for America. Within minutes, it was trending. Cable news went wild. Commentators debated whether the vice president's office had overstepped. Religious freedom groups issued open letters. An op-ed in the Wall Street Journal ran the headline, "The Day the Pew Became the Pulpit." But for Karoline, the moment wasn't about media or even politics. It was about the quiet courage to stand still and speak. Her office door creaked open. Emma peeked in. We've had 32 invitations from churches, conferences, and networks asking you to come speak. Karoline looked down at her folded prayer one more time. Tell them I didn't write that to be famous. Emma smiled. Yeah, but that's what makes it matter. Karoline stood and walked to the window. The DC skyline stretched out, bathed in soft gold and long shadows. For a moment, she closed her eyes and whispered the first line of her prayer again. Lord, grant us clarity. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time, she was sure the country was listening. By Friday morning, the story had ignited a cultural flashpoint. News anchors couldn't avoid it. Late-night hosts couldn't mock it fast enough. And political commentators, left, right, and center, were forced to weigh in. On The View, Joy Behar rolled her eyes and said, It's not like she was arrested. It was a time constraint. People love playing the victim. On Fox and Friends, Ainsley Earhardt said through tears, She didn't lash out. She didn't storm off. She stood where she was and gave glory to God. That's leadership. Even The Atlantic ran a rare spiritual editorial titled Karoline Leavitt and the Gospel of Standing Anyway. But while the pundits spun narratives, Karoline remained silent. Not because she was avoiding the firestorm, she was walking through it with purpose. That afternoon, she traveled to a small church in Richmond, Virginia, one of the many invitations she had received. This one came from a black Southern Baptist pastor who simply wrote, "You may not be from my world, but your prayer reached mine. That's enough for me." When she arrived, the church was already packed. Not with MAGA hats or political banners, but with people. Young and old, liberal and conservative, Catholic, Protestant, unaffiliated. And every one of them had come to hear the girl who wasn't allowed to speak. She didn't bring a podium. She didn't need a stage. Just a wooden pew and the prayer that had already crossed every line drawn to keep it in. She read it again, this time slower, her voice warmer, deeper, and then she added a line not in the original. "I thank God they took my mic, because it made me speak from my soul." The congregation rose to its feet, not with wild cheering but in reverent silence. In the back row, an elderly woman whispered to her husband, "She's not performing. She's testifying." By the end of the service, the pastor leaned into the mic and said something no one expected. "Miss Leavitt, we'd be honored if you delivered our Easter message." Karoline's eyes welled. She had lost a microphone in D.C., but in doing so, she had found 1,000 more. The church was standing room only. It was Easter Sunday, 10 days after Karoline's impromptu prayer at St. Luke's, and the small Richmond sanctuary had become a national focal point. News vans parked across the street. Volunteers stood shoulder to shoulder handing out bulletins. Reporters weren't allowed inside, but they lingered near the windows, hoping to catch a moment. Inside, Karoline sat in the front pew, palms resting in her lap. Her silver cross caught a beam of sunlight sneaking through the stained glass window, resting like a spotlight across her chest. The pastor approached the pulpit and smiled gently. "We all know why we're here, but I'd like to invite someone who reminded the world that faith isn't measured by stage time. It's measured by presence." He nodded toward her. Karoline stood, prayer folded in her hand once again, but this time she didn't open it. Instead, she took the mic and looked out over a sea of expectant faces. People who had driven from 4 states, people who weren't religious, people who disagreed with her politics, but respected her voice. She spoke softly, but firmly. "I had prepared something, but if there's one thing this past week has taught me, it's that God doesn't always want us to read from the page. Sometimes He wants us to speak from the wound." A hush swept the crowd. I was silenced once, not with violence, not with hate, just quietly, strategically. I wasn't deemed suitable, not because I cursed, not because I disrespected, but because I might have said something real. She paused. And in that moment, I understood what many of you have felt for years. What it's like to be told your faith is too loud, your values too sharp, your God too inconvenient. The sanctuary was still. But I'm here to tell you, if your mic is taken, speak anyway. If your name is erased, stand anyway. If your prayer is unwelcome, pray louder, not to provoke, but to witness. Eyes glistened, hands pressed together in reverence. Because resurrection doesn't begin with applause. It begins in silence, in rejection, and in courage. She stepped back from the mic. The silence was holy. And then, a single amen, followed by dozens more. The church shook not with noise, but with purpose. Karoline had delivered more than a message. She had delivered a movement. 3 weeks had passed since the microphone at St. Luke's was taken. Karoline never asked for it back. She didn't need to. In that time, her impromptu aisle prayer had been aired on over 30 networks. Her Easter message from Richmond had been translated into 7 languages. Students had quoted her words in class. Faith leaders had preached them from pulpits. Even secular newspapers admitted reluctantly that something real had happened. She hadn't gone viral because she tried to. She'd gone viral because she didn't flinch. One afternoon back in D.C., Karoline sat quietly in her White House office. On the wall behind her desk now hung a framed photo. The moment she stood in the aisle of St. Luke's, no mic, no lights, just truth. Underneath it, a simple engraving read, "She didn't need permission to pray." Emma knocked softly and entered. Another request came in. NBC wants to do a Profiles in Courage segment. Karoline smiled faintly. "Let them profile someone else. I'm just doing my job." Emma hesitated. There's one more thing. Kamala's office reached out. Karoline raised an eyebrow. She's requesting a private sit-down. No cameras, no aides, just the two of you. Karoline didn't answer right away. She stared at the framed photo behind her, the weight of silence pressing gently against her shoulders. Tell her I'll meet, she finally said. But not to fight. Emma nodded. To forgive? Karoline's voice was calm. To remind her what we both claim to stand for. That evening, before leaving the office, Karoline opened her drawer and pulled out the original copy of her prayer, creased, weathered, and faintly stained from the pew where she'd first read it aloud. She glanced at the final line. If our words are not welcome from the pulpit, let our pews become pulpits, and our voices still rise. She folded it gently and placed it back in the drawer. The story hadn't ended in that church. It had only begun. Because prayers don't need microphones. Only conviction. Karoline Leavitt walked into that cathedral expecting to share a quiet prayer. What she didn't expect was to start a national reckoning. When her name vanished from the program and her mic was silently pulled, it wasn't just an attempt to control time. It was an attempt to control truth. But instead of walking out or lashing out, she stood up, in the very aisle they tried to keep her in, and delivered the words they feared most. Not outrage, not politics, but prayer. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She simply spoke, and that's why it mattered. Because in a time when silence is often forced on the bold, Karoline reminded the world that faith, real faith, doesn't need permission to speak. It only needs courage. She turned a pew into a pulpit, and her voice, soft, steady, uninvited, reached farther than any microphone ever could.